December 15, 1944. The skies over the Belgian Ardennes hung thick with clouds at 8,000 feet, visibility measured in mere hundreds of meters. Far below, in a snow-covered forest clearing, Oberst Friedrich Hartmann studied the overcast ceiling through his field glasses and allowed himself a rare smile. "They're blind out there," he told his operations officer, Major Werner Stolz. "Their precious air superiority means nothing when they cannot see us." Neither man knew that at that very moment, 60 kilometers away, a young American technical sergeant was watching every vehicle in their convoy crawl across his cathode ray tube like illuminated insects on a dark canvas. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how invisible eyes transformed the nature of conflict, how a generation of military minds, trained to think in terms of visual observation, collided with a technology that rendered weather itself obsolete, and how a fundamental misunderstanding of what the enemy could and could not perceive led to one of the most decisive surprises of the war's final year. Technical Sergeant Robert Henshaw had never expected to spend the war staring at a green screen in a cramped trailer. The 23-year-old from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, had imagined himself perhaps as a bomber crewman, or at least doing something that felt more directly connected to victory. Instead, he found himself at Forward Radar Station Baker 7, positioned on a hilltop near Liège, operating an SCR 584 radar set that the Army insisted was going to revolutionize everything. Most days, Henshaw wasn't convinced. The radar set itself was an impressive piece of machinery, weighing nearly 2,000 pounds and requiring a dedicated generator truck. Its rotating antenna swept the sky and ground in regular intervals, sending out pulses of electromagnetic energy and painting returns on the circular display Henshaw monitored. On clear days, it could detect aircraft at distances exceeding 100 kilometers. But what the technical manuals hadn't emphasized, and what Henshaw and his fellow operators had discovered through trial and error, was that it could also paint ground targets, vehicles, troop concentrations, even artillery batteries, if the conditions were right. On that December morning, Henshaw had been on duty since 0400 hours. His shift partner, Corporal James DeMarco from Brooklyn, was dozing in a chair behind him, officially on break, but really just exhausted from 36 consecutive hours of operation. The past week had been quieter than usual. The weather had been terrible, keeping both sides' aircraft grounded, and the ground war had seemed to settle into the winter stalemate that characterized this phase of operations. Then at 0632, Henshaw noticed something unusual. The returns weren't aircraft. He'd learned to distinguish those immediately by their speed and altitude. These were ground contacts, lots of them, moving in organized columns along roads that intelligence had marked as lightly used. Henshaw leaned closer to the scope, adjusting the gain to clarify the images. He counted at least 40 distinct contacts in one column alone, moving at speeds consistent with vehicles, not foot traffic. "Hey, DeMarco," Henshaw said without looking away from the screen. "Wake up. I think we've got something." DeMarco stirred, rubbing his eyes. "What kind of something?" "Movement. Heavy movement. Multiple columns." That got DeMarco's attention. He moved to Henshaw's side, studying the scope. "Where?" "Here." Henshaw pointed to a sector of the display. "And here. And wait, here too. Jesus, Jim, there's a lot of them." DeMarco's face went pale. "That's the Ardennes sector. Intelligence said it was quiet there." "Yeah, well, intelligence didn't have one of these." Henshaw tapped the radar console. "I'm calling it in." 12 kilometers from Henshaw's position, Captain Michael Chen of the 425th Signals Intelligence Company received the radar report with initial skepticism. The 31-year-old officer from San Francisco had spent 2 years analyzing German communications patterns and had developed what he considered a reliable understanding of enemy capabilities and intentions. The Ardennes front was supposed to be a rest sector, where exhausted divisions went to recover. Large-scale movements there made no sense. But Chen was also a believer in evidence over assumption. He had the radar reports cross-referenced with other intelligence sources. Within an hour, signals intercepts began showing increased radio traffic in the same sectors. Aerial reconnaissance photographs from the previous day taken during a brief break in the cloud cover, showed vehicle tracks in areas previously reported as inactive. Separately, each piece was interesting. Together, they painted a picture Chen found deeply troubling. He picked up his field telephone and called Corps headquarters. "Sir, this is Captain Chen, 425th Signals. I need to report probable enemy buildup in the Ardennes sector. Strength unknown but potentially significant." Meanwhile, back in the snow-covered forest, Oberst Hartmann was congratulating himself on perfect timing. The massive operation his forces were supporting, the largest German offensive of the war's latter stages, had been planned around the weather forecast. High Command had specifically chosen this period because extended poor weather would ground Allied aircraft and blind Allied reconnaissance. Everything depended on achieving complete surprise. Hartmann commanded a signals security unit, responsible for maintaining radio silence and ensuring that troop movements left minimal signature. His orders were explicit: nothing that could alert the enemy. No unnecessary radio transmissions. Minimal vehicle lighting. Movement only during limited windows when aerial observation was impossible. "We have achieved complete surprise," Hartmann told his assembled officers during a briefing that morning. "The American and British forces opposite our positions remain in standard defensive deployment. They have detected nothing. When our offensive begins tomorrow morning, we will catch them entirely unprepared." Major Stoltz, his operations officer, shared his commander's confidence but raised a practical concern. "Herr Oberst, what about their radar systems? We know they have deployed mobile radar units." Hartmann waved the concern away. "Their radar is designed for aircraft detection. Ground clutter would overwhelm any attempt to track vehicle movement, and in any case our movement discipline has been excellent. No, Werner, they are blind out there. We have verified this through our own reconnaissance. They are completely unaware." What Hartmann didn't know, what German intelligence had failed to fully appreciate, was that American radar technology had evolved significantly from the systems they had encountered earlier in the war. The newer SCR sets, particularly when operated by trained technicians who understood their capabilities, could indeed detect ground movement under certain conditions. The heavy cloud cover that Hartmann viewed as protective concealment actually enhanced radar performance in some ways, reducing atmospheric interference and making ground returns clearer. More critically, Hartmann's intelligence on Allied dispositions was already 12 hours out of date. Based on Henshaw's radar reports and Chen's analysis, American commanders had begun repositioning forces. Reserve units were being alerted. Artillery coordinates were being calculated. Supply lines were being secured. The blindness Hartmann believed in was entirely imaginary. By late afternoon on December 15th, the Allied command structure was buzzing with activity. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, intelligence officers were assembling a comprehensive picture from multiple sources. Radar reports provided real-time movement data. Signals intercepts indicated command structure activation. Prisoner interrogations from other sectors mentioned divisions that had disappeared from the order of battle. Weather reconnaissance confirmed that conditions would remain poor for days, exactly the window a major operation would require. Lieutenant Colonel David Palmer, serving as operations officer for a forward-deployed armored unit, received his alert orders at 1600 hours. The 42-year-old career officer from Virginia had seen enough of war to recognize when things were about to get serious. "Gentlemen," he told his company commanders, "intelligence indicates possible major enemy offensive in our sector within 24 to 48 hours. We are moving to forward defensive positions immediately." One of his commanders, Captain Robert Taylor, looked surprised. "Sir, I thought this sector was quiet. Where's this intelligence coming from?" "Multiple sources," Palmer replied, "including radar tracking of large-scale vehicle movements. The details don't matter. What matters is we're not going to be caught sleeping." "Radar can see ground vehicles?" Taylor asked, skeptical. "Apparently so, Captain, and I'm grateful for it. Now let's move." As American forces adjusted their positions, German units continued their approach, confident in their concealment. Thousands of soldiers moved through the darkness. Artillery pieces were positioned. Ammunition was stockpiled. Officers at every level had been briefed on the crucial importance of surprise. Many of them, like Hartmann, believed absolutely that they had achieved it. Oberleutnant Klaus Schneider, a 29-year-old company commander from Munich, huddled with his platoon leaders in a frozen barn on the evening of December 15th. His orders were to advance at 05:30 the following morning as part of the initial assault wave. According to intelligence, they would be facing light American forces in routine defensive positions. "The Americans do not expect us," Schneider told his men. "Our approach has been completely undetected. When we strike tomorrow, the surprise will be total." His platoon sergeant, Feldwebel Hans Richter, a veteran of campaigns in the East, nodded agreement. "The men are ready, Herr Oberleutnant. Spirits are high." What Schneider and Richter couldn't know was that less than 3 kilometers away, American machine gun crews were already establishing fields of fire, calculated to intersect exactly with the approach routes German units would take. Artillery forward observers had coordinates plotted based on predicted enemy assembly areas. Tank destroyers were positioned at key junctions. None of this would have been possible without the warning provided by radar surveillance and the intelligence analysis that followed. Technical Sergeant Henshaw remained at his radar scope through the night of December 15th into December 16th. The contacts he'd first detected that morning had continued to multiply. By midnight, he was tracking what appeared to be battalion-sized formations in multiple sectors. The display painted a picture of massive preparation that he found both fascinating and terrifying. "They've got to know we can see them, right?" DeMarco asked at one point. Henshaw shook his head. "I don't think they do, Jim. I really don't think they do. Look at their movement patterns. They're not taking any of the countermeasures you'd use if you knew you were being tracked. They're just proceeding like nobody's watching. That's going to be a hell of a surprise for them tomorrow." "Yeah," Henshaw agreed quietly. "Yeah, it is." When the offensive began on the morning of December 16th, German forces did achieve tactical surprise in many sectors. It was impossible to predict every point of contact across such a broad front. But the strategic surprise that High Command had counted on, the complete unpreparedness that was supposed to enable rapid breakthrough and exploitation, simply didn't exist. American units that should have been overrun in minutes put up fierce resistance. Artillery that should have been caught in bivouac delivered devastating defensive fire. Reserve forces that should have taken days to arrive were already moving into blocking positions. At every level, German commanders found themselves facing opposition that shouldn't have been there, resistance that shouldn't have been prepared, responses that shouldn't have been possible. Oberst Hartmann's first indication that something had gone wrong came at 0700 hours, 90 minutes into the offensive. Radio reports, despite standing orders for silence, began flooding in as commanders requested support, reported unexpected resistance, asked for clarification of objectives. Major Stolz entered the command post with a grave expression. "Herr Oberst, we have a problem. Multiple units report that American forces appear to have been expecting our approach. Defensive positions are stronger than anticipated. Artillery response has been immediate and accurate." Hartmann felt his confidence evaporate. "How is this possible? We maintained complete radio silence. We moved only under weather cover. They should have been blind." "I don't know, sir," Stolz admitted, but something clearly alerted them. As the day progressed, the scope of the problem became clear. The offensive was meeting resistance that wasn't supposed to exist. The timetable, carefully calculated based on assumptions of surprise and rapid advance, was already falling apart. Units that should have advanced 10 kilometers had covered 3. Objectives that should have fallen in hours remained in American hands. Oberleutnant Schneider's company, advancing through morning fog, walked almost directly into prepared defensive positions. The firefight that erupted was intense and costly. Within minutes, Schneider had taken casualties that should have taken days to accumulate. When his radio operator managed to establish communication with battalion, the message he received was simple: continue the advance. But how could they advance when the Americans had clearly prepared for them? Schneider found himself pinned down behind a low ridge, artillery falling around his positions with suspicious accuracy, machine gun fire intersecting from positions that commanded every approach. This wasn't the light resistance they'd been promised. Feldwebel Richter crawled to Schneider's position, his face smeared with dirt and snow. "Herr Oberleutnant, the Americans were waiting for us. This position was prepared days ago, maybe weeks. This wasn't thrown together this morning." Schneider could only shake his head in confusion and frustration. "Battalion says intelligence confirmed surprise. How could intelligence be so wrong?" 3 days into the offensive, Captain Chen was compiling an after-action report on the intelligence preparation. The radar surveillance that Henshaw and dozens of other operators had provided had been crucial to the defensive response. While German forces had achieved some gains through sheer weight of numbers, the strategic breakthrough they'd sought had been impossible from the start because the element of surprise had never existed. The Germans assumed that poor weather created a surveillance gap, Chen wrote in his analysis. They planned an entire operation around the belief that we couldn't see them. That belief was incorrect. Radar technology provided continuous surveillance regardless of weather conditions. This represents a fundamental shift in the nature of military operations. Lieutenant Colonel Palmer, whose armored unit had played a key role in containing the offensive, put it more bluntly in his own report. The enemy made excellent use of weather and terrain to conceal movement from visual observation. What they failed to account for was that we weren't relying on visual observation. Our radar operators gave us eyes that weather couldn't close. By late December, the offensive had stalled completely. German forces, having achieved some tactical success but no strategic breakthrough, found themselves overextended and vulnerable. The surprise they had counted on had never materialized. The blindness they had attributed to their opponents had been their own. Oberst Hartmann, reviewing intelligence reports in the operation's aftermath, finally understood what had happened. An interrogation report from a captured American radar operator explained the technology in detail. Hartmann read it with growing dismay, recognizing that every assumption underlying the offensive's planning had been based on an outdated understanding of enemy capabilities. "They could see us the entire time," he told Stolz, "every vehicle, every troop movement. We believed we were invisible, and we were actually illuminated on their screens like stars in a night sky." "How could our intelligence not know this?" Stolz asked, frustrated. "Because we thought we understood their radar," Hartmann replied. "We knew about it, we'd encountered it before, but we understood it as anti-aircraft technology. We didn't grasp that they'd adapted it for ground surveillance. We saw what we expected to see rather than what was actually there." Technical Sergeant Henshaw received a commendation for his radar surveillance work, though the citation was necessarily vague for security reasons. More importantly to Henshaw, he'd come to understand that his work wasn't peripheral to the war effort. It was central. Those hours staring at a green screen, tracking contacts that appeared and disappeared, had been more consequential than any bombing mission might have been. "You helped save thousands of lives," Captain Chen told him when delivering the commendation. "Because of what you and operators like you detected, we weren't caught unprepared. Units had time to position themselves. Artillery had coordinates plotted. Commanders understood the scope of what was coming. That's not peripheral work, Sergeant. That's exactly the work that wins wars." For the German forces, the failed offensive marked a turning point, not just because of the territory lost or the casualties sustained, but because of what it revealed about their understanding of modern warfare. They had planned an entire operation around assumptions that were no longer valid. They had believed in concealment that didn't exist. They had attacked enemies they thought were blind, only to discover those enemies had been watching every move. In his personal diary, which would survive the war, Oberst Hartmann wrote a sobering reflection. "We prepared for the war we understood, while the enemy fought the war that actually existed. We thought weather gave us invisibility. It gave them a screen on which to watch us more clearly. We said they're blind out there, but the blindness was entirely our own." The technical revolution that radar represented went beyond simple detection. It fundamentally altered the calculus of military planning. Concealment that had worked for thousands of years, weather, darkness, terrain, no longer provided the protection commanders had always counted on. A new kind of visibility had emerged, one that operated by rules many senior officers didn't yet fully understand. Lieutenant Colonel Palmer, in his later career, would often reflect on that December offensive as a turning point, not just in the war but in military thinking itself. There was a generation gap. He later wrote, between commanders who thought in terms of what could be seen with eyes and those who understood that seeing had been redefined. Some of our own officers struggled with the idea that radar could track ground vehicles reliably. The German commanders who planned their offensive simply couldn't conceive that weather was no longer the concealment they'd always known it to be. The offensive that Oberst Hartmann had believed would benefit from complete surprise instead demonstrated how technology could make surprise itself nearly impossible to achieve. In an age of radar, radio intercept, signals intelligence and aerial reconnaissance, the idea of moving thousands of troops and vehicles into position without detection was becoming obsolete. Young soldiers like Oberleutnant Schneider, who had trusted that their commanders understood the battlefield and the enemy's capabilities, learned a harsh lesson about how quickly those capabilities could evolve. Schneider survived the offensive, though his company was reduced to less than 30% of its original strength. In letters home, he wrote about the experience with a tone of disillusionment that was common among soldiers on both sides in the war's final stages. "We were told the enemy was blind," he wrote to his father in January 1945. "We believed our leaders understood the situation. We advanced expecting to find confusion and unpreparedness. Instead, we found prepared positions, accurate artillery, and enemies who knew exactly where to expect us. Someone was seeing everything, and it was not us." The technology that had enabled this seeing, radar surveillance systems like the SCR-584 that Henshaw operated, would continue to evolve rapidly after the war. What had been cutting-edge experimental capability in 1944 would become standard equipment by 1950. The principle it demonstrated, that electromagnetic radiation could provide surveillance regardless of visual conditions, would shape military planning for generations. But in that December of 1944, it was still new enough to surprise even experienced commanders. It was still possible for an entire general staff to plan a major operation around assumptions about enemy blindness that were simply wrong. It was still possible to believe that weather and darkness and radio silence created invisibility, when in fact they created only a different kind of visibility. Captain Chen, compiling lessons learned from the intelligence operation, emphasized this point in his final report. Future conflicts will be fought increasingly by technologies that operate beyond human sensory range. Radar, signals intelligence, and other technical means will provide battlespace awareness that commanders must learn to integrate and trust. The side that understands this and adapts to it will hold an enormous advantage over forces still thinking in terms of visual observation and conventional concealment. For Technical Sergeant Henshaw, the experience transformed his understanding of his own role. He had joined the army wanting to be part of something important, something decisive. He'd been disappointed initially to find himself in what seemed like a technical support role. But that December, staring at those green traces on his cathode ray tube, he'd held information that commanders desperately needed, information that would help save lives and shape the outcome of an entire campaign. Years later, at a reunion of signals intelligence personnel, Henshaw would meet some of the officers who had acted on his radar reports. They told him about decisions made, orders given, positions prepared, all based on the contacts he'd detected and reported. He learned that his December 15th morning shift, when he'd first noticed those unusual ground returns, had been the beginning of an intelligence cascade that reached all the way to Supreme Headquarters. "I didn't feel like a hero," Henshaw told the gathering. "I was just trying to do my job well. But I learned something important that winter. Sometimes the most important work is the work that prevents disasters, rather than causing victories. We didn't defeat them in December because of brilliant tactics or overwhelming force. We defeated them because we knew they were coming, and we knew it because technology let us see when they thought we were blind." The German military, for its part, would spend the war's remaining months grappling with the implications of their December failure. The offensive had consumed resources they could not replace, exhausted units that could not be reconstituted, and revealed vulnerabilities in their intelligence assessment that could not be easily corrected. Oberst Hartmann, transferred to a rear area position after the offensive's collapse, spent much of his time reviewing the operation's planning and execution. He compiled a detailed report on lessons learned, focusing particularly on the surveillance capabilities his side had failed to account for. The report was distributed to senior staff, but had little practical impact. By then, the overall strategic situation made such tactical improvements largely irrelevant. In his private correspondence, Hartmann was more direct about his conclusions. "We built our plan on beliefs rather than facts," he wrote to a fellow officer. "We believed the weather would blind them. We believed radio silence would conceal us. We believed our movement discipline was sufficient. Every belief was reasonable based on past experience. Every belief was wrong. The Americans had capabilities we didn't understand, and they used them effectively while we stumbled forward, convinced of our invisibility." The snow that had fallen so heavily in mid-December eventually melted. Spring came to the Ardennes, revealing landscapes scarred by fighting, abandoned equipment, and countless markers for soldiers who hadn't survived. The offensive that was supposed to have changed the war's trajectory instead accelerated its end, consuming resources Germany could not spare in pursuit of an objective that had been unattainable from the start. Technical innovations rarely announced themselves with fanfare. Radar surveillance of ground targets wasn't a breakthrough that captured headlines or imagined popular imagination, but it represented a fundamental shift in what was possible, in how battles could be fought, in what concealment meant and didn't mean. It made visible what had always been invisible before, and in doing so, changed everything. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.